Dear sisters and brothers, dear friends, I welcome you in the name of the Franz Rosenfeld Loge from Düsseldorf. It's a special lecture, I would say, and we are very curious to hear it. The subject that we're going to hear today is Hillel Kook and the rescue of Jews during the Shoah. And our lecturer is going to be Professor Becky Kook, his daughter, which is a very special connection, I think, and probably we're going to get a lot of information that you normally probably don't get if you hear it from people that are not so related to the subject. I would suggest, so everybody has the chance, not disturbing, to put the microphones on mute and to put the questions in the chat, so we can, after the lecture, if there are some questions, talk about them. And I will ask Brother Michael Naor to give maybe a short information about our lecturer, since he knows more than we all, I assume. And I wish you all a pleasant and interesting lecture.
Thank you, Odette. So good evening, everybody. Our president, Odette Horowitz, already welcomed everybody. Allow me to personally welcome Les Glassman, special guest from Jerusalem. I was hoping to welcome also my relative, also from Jerusalem, Larry Pfeffer. Les and Larry have been very active for many years in preserving the heritage of the Holocaust, of the Shoah, as we say, not Holocaust, but the Shoah, with a special focus on those persons, Jews and non-Jews, who did everything they could, including risking their own life in order to save Jews in Nazi era, Nazi-occupied Europe. And as our sages already taught us, he who saves one life saves the world entire. And it was, as a matter of fact, it was Larry Pfeffer who drew my attention to that important issue, which is unfortunately still one of the less known chapters concerning the era of the Holocaust. And this evening we have this very rare and special occasion and opportunity to hear the story of one of those rescuers, Hillel Kook, told by his own daughter. And it's a great privilege and pleasure to welcome Professor Becky Kook amongst us. Professor Kook has studied and taught, taught in several universities, amongst others at the Columbia University in New York, the Tel Aviv University. She is a professor of politics at the the Ben Gurion University in Be'er Sheva. And yes, dear Becky Kook, it's thank you for being with us tonight, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Thanks a lot for inviting me, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I think, since we're such a small group, I'm going to try and kind of make it a little bit less formal than I had intended. I have a written lecture and I have a PowerPoint, and I'll use the PowerPoint because I have a lot of visuals that I think are very kind of contribute to the story. But basically, I'm very happy. I'm always very happy at an opportunity to talk about my father. I think every daughter is happy for an opportunity to talk about their father. Hillel Kook was not merely my father. He was a very important person in the history and the pre-state history of Israel. He was together with David Raziel in the 1930s, one of the founders of the Irgun Tzvai Leumi. Let me just say that since we are such a small group and I really don't know kind of what your background is and how much you know or you do not know, as far as I'm concerned, it's fine if you interrupt me and ask me questions or, make comments. That's fine with me. I mean, I hope that I'm not going against protocol here, but anyway, so as far as I'm concerned, it's if you can interrupt me and we can have a discussion. In any case, so in the 1930s, he was the founder with David Raziel of the Irgun Tzvai Leumi. From 1937 to 1940, he was in Europe. He was sent to Europe to assist in illegal immigration that was organized by the Irgun. He worked very closely with Jabotinsky. In 1940, he joined Jabotinsky in the United States, where he spent the next 8 years from 1940 to 1948. He was a political activist and a political lobbyist. I think long before political lobbies were actually invented. His group was one of the first modern political lobbies. In 1948, the committee that he was the head of at that time raised the funds that purchased the ship Altalena that reached the shores of Israel on the eve of independence. He was imprisoned by Ben Gurion as a result of his involvement with the Altalena. He was released, and then he was elected to Israel's Constituent Assembly, which became Israel's first parliament. He fought for the writing of a constitution in Israel. And of course, perhaps more importantly or most significantly, during the Holocaust, during the war years, when he was in the United States, he established the Emergency Committee to Save the Jews of Europe, which was a committee that promoted rescue and lobbied the Roosevelt administration. The Emergency Committee is accredited with the saving of approximately 200,000 Jews. And that will be the main topic of my conversation tonight. But I'd like to kind of preface it all by just kind of sharing a few thoughts with you. For those of you, Michael and Les, I know that you've heard my lecture before, and so I always kind of preface it with a few thoughts that I have about memory and about forgetting. As Michael said, I'm a professor of political science, but one of my main research interests is in the notion of collective memory and how societies remember their past. And one thing about my father, which is very compelling to me and probably the main motivation that I have in lecturing about him and talking about him, is that Hillel Kook, despite everything that I told you and despite all of his achievements and his activities, is really quite a forgotten hero in the collective memory of Israel. He's not written about in history books. He's not commemorated in Israel. There's no street that's named after him. In the United States, there's a lot more activity and a lot more writing about him, but in Israel, he's really kind of forgotten. He's not included in the narrative that Israelis remember about their own history. And as someone who deals with collective memory kind of professionally, I know, Michael, you're a psychologist, so not on a kind of individual psychological level, but on a social political level, collective memory is a very political thing. The leadership of states and societies construct a collective memory, and they determine who are its heroes and who are its forgotten heroes. And you can learn a lot from looking at a collective memory. And Hillel Kook, I think, was kind of written out of the narrative because of this political nature of collective memory. And Hillel Kook I will not be talking much about this, but that would be a topic of a different lecture. He was neither on the right and he was neither on the left. I mean, even though he was affiliated with the right wing because he was a follower of Jabotinsky and he was a member of the Irgun and he was on the Cherut list to the parliament and in the first parliament, but he was definitely his own person, and he was an independent thinker, and he spoke out. And he spoke truth to power, if I want to use that phrase. And with the leadership of the right wing for many years up until today, Hillel Kook is someone who we do not talk about. And you know, the fact that the left was in power for many years, it's very clear why they have written him out of history. So the end of it, the end of the story really is that when we talk about Hillel Kook, we look at those pockets of forgetfulness in our collective memory. And, you know, I often in my lectures, I like to quote the French historian Ernst Renan, who wrote a very famous essay called What is a Nation? And in his essay about what is a nation, he wrote this in the 19th century, he says that we can actually learn a lot about the identity of our nation, not only by looking at what they remember together, but actually by looking at what they forget together. And so this evening, I'm going to talk to you about a forgotten episode in the history of our people, the Jewish people, in the history of my nation, the Israeli nation. And I would suggest that perhaps by kind of spending a little time talking about this forgotten episode, we will not only learn a little bit about something which is very important in the history of our nation, but also we will learn a little bit about the identity of who we are, because you can learn a lot about our identity by looking at what we remember and what we forget. So now I'll just tell you a little bit, kind of a little bit of background about my father. So Hillel Kook was born in a very small town called Kook in Lithuania in around 1915. I mean, in those years, it wasn't really well documented. So we think he was born in around 1915. And I'll share my screen now with you. Okay, can you see it? Yeah, okay. So his father, the picture on my right, I don't know what you see it, was the Rabbi Dov HaKohen Kook. He was a rabbi, and my grandfather's brother was Harav Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, who was a very famous rabbi. He was the founder, basically, of the religious Zionist movement. He was a very important theologian. He was the first chief rabbi of Palestine, and he was a very, very significant person and character in the history of Judaism and in the history of Israel. So my father basically grew up in Jerusalem. They emigrated to Palestine when he was around 9, so like in 1924. He grew up in Jerusalem. There were 8 children, 4 brothers and 4 sisters. And although they were a very Orthodox and religious family, they were a very liberal and very accepting and inclusive family. They were very, I know that my father, whenever he spoke about his father and whenever he spoke about his uncle, he spoke about them with a lot of admiration, and he always emphasized the presence of humanistic values in the family. I mean, just kind of as a small example, for his 4 sisters, all of them studied and went on to become scientists. And so it was very accepting and very inclusive. And I mention this because I really do think that my father was very influenced by the atmosphere in his home and by his family when he was growing up. And I think that, you know, many people, when they hear about Hillel Kook and when they hear about the story, one of the questions that immediately comes to mind is, why did Hillel Kook respond the way that he responded during the Holocaust? What made him able to respond so quickly and so immediately when faced with the disaster and the destruction and the horrible news of the extermination of the Jews? And I often think that, a partial reason is the values that he grew up with. and the humanist values and these kind of universal values, where everyone was accepted as a human being. So he was educated in Merkaz Harav, which was the center of Jewish learning and rabbinical learning that his uncle established in Jerusalem. He later went on to Hebrew University, but in Merkaz Harav, he met David Raziel, whose picture you see on the screen, who, as I said, was the original founder of the Irgun. He was older than my father, but he took him under his wing. They became very, very close friends. And my father always spoke about David Raziel as being his main soulmate, actually, for the few years that actually Raziel was alive when my father knew him. And David Raziel took my father, who was very young at the time, he was 16, and together they founded the Irgun with another group of people around them. The Irgun was actually a very important and significant identity for my father as he developed his political opinion and his political worldview. And I won't go into that now, but I'd be happy to talk about that in question. So he establishes the Irgun in the early 1930s. In 1937, he's sent by the Irgun to Europe to help organize illegal immigration. So he scuttles in Europe between Poland and Switzerland and France and London. His base was in London. It always amazes me how during those years when Europe was really seething with tremendous processes of change and and the rise of power of fascism, how actually a young Palestinian Jew could come to Europe with a laissez-passer. He didn't have a passport because they were under British rule, and he managed, it was very cosmopolitan, I mean, at the time. He traveled a lot. He helped organize illegal immigration in Warsaw and in Poland. And then the war breaks out in 1939, and in 1940, Jabotinsky, who's based in London, and my father also joined him in London, decides that actually there's nothing to be done in Europe because Europe is closed, is locked down, is being taken over by the Nazi machine. And he decides to move to relocate himself to the United States, where he believes that he could actually organize the Jewish communities in the United States and promote his political plan, which I'll tell you about a little in a minute. And he asks my father to join him. So in 1940, my father joins Jabotinsky in New York. He manages, he has 2 months with Jabotinsky because Jabotinsky passes away in August of 1940. But during those years, they have many conversations. He's very, very influenced by Jabotinsky. He admires Jabotinsky very much. And he's immediately kind of recruited to take on Jabotinsky's project, which was to lobby the Allies and to lobby Roosevelt administration to allow them to establish a Jewish army. The idea of the Jewish army is also kind of, this is a project of Jabotinsky during World War I. He had the Jewish Brigade, and in World War II, indeed, he wants to establish a Jewish army, which would consist of Jews that would be able to fight alongside the Allies against the Nazis and the Axis powers. So Hillel Kook immediately takes on this project, and he doesn't work alone, and this is very important for me to mention. He becomes a head of the Irgun delegation in the United States, but he's joined by other colleagues of his from the Irgun and also from Beitar. Samuel Merlin, who became a lifelong friend and really a political comrade of his in all of his political work. Alex Raphael Hadani, Eri Jabotinsky, who is the only son of Jabotinsky, and they become, after I think David Raziel, Eri Jabotinsky is my father's closest friend, Yitzhak Ben Ami and Aryeh Ben Eliezer, and they immediately kind of become mobilized. They establish a committee, which is what they do. They established many committees in the United States. So the first committee that they establish is the Committee for Stateless and Palestinian Jews, the Committee for a Jewish Army of Stateless and Palestinian Jews. And they start working, they start lobbying, they start sending letters, publishing ads in the newspaper, and trying to garner support for this idea of establishing a Jewish army. Okay, wait, maybe I'll stop share here for a minute. So they're very, very active in this idea of promoting support for a Jewish army. And then, as my father said many, many times, one morning in the fall of 1942, he opens the newspapers. He opens, I think he was in Washington at the time, and he opens the Washington Post, and he reads in a very, very small item in one of the back pages of the newspaper, a small item that says, Rabbi Stephen Wise, who was one of the main leaders of organized American Jewry at the time, holds a press conference and announces that it seems that up till now, 2 million Jews in Europe have already been exterminated. And this is a tremendous shock for my father and for everybody, and for his entire life. I mean, for every interview that he's told and in every book that's been written about him, this has been a constitutive event. It was a seminal event for him in his political awareness, and it transformed his agenda. He said that from that moment on, the only thing that he could think about was how to save Jews. And he realized that the idea of a Jewish army and all the other ideas, as important as they were, needed to take second place compared with the issue of rescue. So in 1942, he and his colleagues in the Irgun delegation, they established the Emergency Committee to Save the Jews of Europe. And from 1942 until the spring of 1945 and the end of the war, they basically dedicate themselves to the issue of rescue and to trying to influence the Roosevelt administration to pursue plans aimed at rescue. Now, here, I'll share the screen again. Second. Okay. Okay, so basically the campaign that they launched, they immediately launched a public relations campaign, which I'll go into with quite detail in a few minutes. But from the moment that he reads this news, they come up with this idea that they need to influence the Roosevelt administration to promote more forcefully for the idea of rescue. And this is not a small endeavor, and it's not a simple task. And it's not a simple task for all of the obvious reasons, but it's primarily not a simple task because of the position of the Roosevelt administration and the British administration about the rescue of Jews. And basically the position that was maintained by the Allied governments during the war regarding the rescue of Jews was that the main and only thing that they can do in order to rescue Jews was to win the war. And that the sooner they win the war, the better it will be for the Jews. And implicit in that position was the idea that any specific plan for rescue, okay, any suggestion, for example, bombing the camps or bombing the railroads, or trying to convince neutral countries to take in refugees, or to convince diplomats to issue false visas, or any other plan like that. Any plan that would be specifically aimed at the rescue of Jews would gear resources and time and attention from the main task at hand, which was to win the war. And now, on a certain level, of course, it makes sense. But I think that in order to understand this specific position that was maintained by Roosevelt throughout the war years, it changed a little bit in 1944, and we'll talk about that. But to understand this position, we need to understand a little bit about America at that time and about the American position in the war. So in October 1942, when Hillel Kook, who I forgot to mention, he actually took on a pseudonym when he was in Europe, and he took on another name, Peter Bergson, to kind of protect his family in Palestine. And this is important because he's known in the United States as Peter Bergson, and his group is known as the Bergson Group. So in October 1942, when they read about this horrific news of 2 million Jews have died, the United States has actually only been an active combatant in the war for a little bit over 6 months. As we all know, the United States entered the war as an active combatant only in December 1941, after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Up till then, they were involved, they were aligned with the Allies, they were involved in the war effort, but they weren't an active combatant in the war effort. And up until December 1941, most Americans didn't want to go to war, right? I mean, most Americans, it was far away. They were recovering from the Depression that happened in 1929. They were recovering from World War I, a whole world war, which they fought, and they suffered many losses and casualties for another war that was played out far away from them. And most Americans just did not want to get involved in the war. Now, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, obviously everything changed because they were attacked directly, and America became involved in two fronts, on the Pacific front and in the European front. But nonetheless, the sentiment that was pervasive amongst Americans, within the American public, and also within the State Department, and we'll talk about that briefly in a minute, was kind of relatively isolationist. They got involved in the war because they had to get involved in the war. They were attacked and they had to recruit, they had to mobilize and fight the war. But nonetheless, the sentiment was very cautious. And so when we think about Roosevelt's position about saving the Jews, that the best thing to do and the only thing to do to save the Jews is to win the war, I think that this context is very important in order to understand it. The position that Roosevelt maintained, that the best way to save the Jews is to win the war, was informed by a number of positions. First of all, it was clearly a military position, which I said before, that there was kind of military logic to it, that they didn't want to sidetrack resources, precious resources, that could serve them in fighting the Germans and in fighting the Japanese. They didn't want to use any of those resources for something else. Okay, so that was kind of a military position. But it was more than that. I think that this position that Roosevelt maintained was informed by deep-seated attitudes amongst the American public and within the State Department of being very cautious and very reluctant to think about immigration, for example. I mean, and if you look at immigration, I have all these kind of statistics, but I won't bore you with the details. But basically, as I'm sure that you all know, America from 1924 and onward was very, very, very strict about immigration, right? I mean, it was very, very hard actually to get a visa to immigrate to the United States. And the difficulties in receiving visas for immigrating continued up until 1939 and from 1939 to 1945. So in addition to the difficulties of managing to escape Europe, Nazi-controlled Europe, in addition to that, the United States was very staunch and very reluctant and very miserly with its interest in receiving immigrants. There were very few number of visas that were granted. The process of getting a visa was very, very arduous. It was very, very difficult. There were a lot of forms, there were a lot of affidavits, there was a lot of support that you needed in order to get a visa. So basically, America was very anti-immigration. And I have no doubt that the anti-immigration position, plus what we now know as very clear anti-Semitic positions amongst the State Department that served under Roosevelt, also informed this position of Roosevelt, right? That the only way to save Jews is to win the war. So that was a very, very big campaign. That was a very, very big obstacle to fight against, this kind of attitude that we do not want, because if you think about it, if you're promoting plans specifically geared at rescue, you need to account for the possibility that the rescue campaigns might succeed. And if the rescue campaigns might succeed, you might be faced with immigrants and refugees who would be clamoring at your gates wanting to come in. And that was something that the American public and the American administration, particularly the State Department, was not interested in. So faced with this position, The Emergency Committee to Save the Jews of Europe, my father's committee, basically decided, they developed their own position, right, a counter position, and they said that actually the best way to save Jews was to save Jews, right? The best way to promote rescue was to try and devise specific plans that were aimed at rescue. And all in all, the main goal of my father's committee, and this really kind of says it all in one line, the main goal of the Emergency Committee to Save the Jews of Europe was that in order to combat destruction on such a massive level, what needs to be done is to establish a government-funded agency that would be devoted full-time towards promoting and devising plans for rescue. He always used to say that if Hitler declared the extermination of Jews as a primary objective of his Nazi war machine, the Allies need to declare the rescue of Jews as a primary war goal, right? I mean, it was that kind of logic. And he would always say to his opponents, of which there were many, particularly Jews, and we'll talk about that later, who would say, but we don't want it to be called a Jewish war. We don't want to be talking about rescue. So he would say, who is going to call it a Jewish war? Hitler calls it a Jewish war. Hitler has already called the war a Jewish war. So who are you afraid of that will call it a Jewish war? So in order to promote this idea of a government agency, my father and his colleagues adopted very kind of intuitively. I mean, and it's interesting. I'm not quite sure myself how they really kind of arrived at this idea, at this notion, that what they basically need to do is that they need to promote a public relations campaign, okay? And what they basically did was that they actually had a public relations campaign for rescue. And underlying that was kind of two fundamental ideas. The first idea was that the American public needs to be made aware and conscious of what is happening in Europe and what is happening to the Jews of Europe. And he believed that if the American public would be aware of it, then they would pressure their representatives, that they would fight and demand from their own representatives that they would change their position on rescue. He was a great believer in American democracy. He was a great believer in the fundamental morality and integrity of the American public. And so the second kind of part of that, I said that there were kind of two underlying logics to his campaign. The first was that the public needs to become aware of it. And the second was that the Holocaust and the extermination of the Jews was not a Jewish problem. Okay, that was kind of also kind of the fundamental logic. It was not a Jewish problem, it was a universal problem. And so when you take those two kind of assumptions together, that's what basically produced this public relations campaign. What you see on this slide are two amazing illustrations by the Polish illustrator and painter Arthur Szyk, who was instrumental in my father's campaign. I'll show you examples of that later on. In this slide, I mean, this is basically what I was talking about before, kind of what does it mean basically to make the American public aware? Michael or Odette, can you tell me when I have like 10 more minutes to go? Okay. Yeah, okay. Just to kind of like to fill in a little bit more of kind of the gaps in knowledge, or kind of to make this kind of a more full picture. Nowadays, it's very kind of common for many people to say that, well, Americans in the free world, they didn't really know, it wasn't really reported. And so, of course, they couldn't really act because they didn't really know. So people, I mean, the information was out there. There's a fascinating book published a number of years ago called Buried by the Times by a historian of communication called Laura Leff. And basically what she did was that she looked at the New York Times during the war years from 1949 till 1945. And she basically went day by day and she documented the amount of items that were dedicated to providing information about the extermination. And what she discovered is very interesting, that in fact, the extermination and the ghettos and the killing and the camps and the transports, they were reported. There was actually a lot of information. However, it was in the back pages of the papers, right? It was buried in the newspapers. It wasn't put on the front page. And there's a very, very significant difference between items that are written up in page 32 and items that are written up on the front page. So what I like to call this is basically there are different levels of knowledge, right? And different levels of understanding. So we can know something, right? But we can know it in a very passive way. And one of the main goals of my father's campaign was to bring the knowledge of the Holocaust from the background into the foreground, to bring it from the back pages into the front pages, okay? So basically to do that, they devised a lot of different strategies, and I'll talk about a few of them. But I do want to mention first up that in all of these public relations strategies and the public relations campaign that he promoted, there was one person who was very, very instrumental. And this person was called Ben Hecht. I don't know, again, I don't know how many of you have heard of Ben Hecht or know of Ben Hecht. As I tell this story and as I get older and as my audiences often get younger, fewer and fewer people know about who Ben Hecht was. But Ben Hecht was actually the major, most important, most popular screenwriter in America. He wrote the scripts of all of the famous movies in the United States in the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s. He was a Jew, but he became Jewish in his awareness and his identity when news of the extermination started to trickle out. And that's when my father met him, and it was a love at first sight. They collaborated for 7 years together. Ben Hecht wrote the texts of the newspaper ads that we'll look at in a minute, of the pageants that they put on. Ben Hecht, most importantly, opened the doors of Hollywood to my father and the committee, and he introduced him to all of the big stars. He organized fundraising activities, and he basically recruited the elite, the cultural and artistic elite of the United States. And there's nothing like a big name, right, to promote an issue. And we know a lot. I have students who are writing about celebrity activism, right? So basically celebrity activism, my father was involved in probably one of the first instances of celebrity activism, right? There were stars, there was, we'll talk about it, like Marlon Brando and Stella Adler and Paul Muni and Edward J. Robinson, and they all were part of this big campaign. Okay, so now I'll talk a little bit about what basically the kind of things that they did, okay? So basically the idea, as I said, was to launch a public relations campaign and to bring news of the extermination to the living room, right? There was no TV, so you do it through the newspapers. For the 3 years that the Emergency Committee acted and was active, they published close to 200 full-page advertisements in newspapers from coast to coast in America. And basically, the idea behind these full-page advertisement was to take those items that were in the back pages, right, and to put them in the front pages, right? So they bought advertising space that was very close to the front page. They were full-page advertisements, and most importantly, they were incredibly provocative, okay? So they caught your eye. They were ads that people could not ignore. One of the ads, which we have on the screen now, which I think is particularly brilliant, it says "For sale to humanity, 70,000 Jews." And basically what it's talking about, if you see kind of in the corner of the ad, I know that it's hard to see because it's very small. It basically reprints a little item that was published in the New York Times. And that item brings to the press an offer that was made by the Romanian government to basically sell Jewish refugees who Romania had deported to the Transnistria region. Now, this offer somehow got from a Dutch businessman who was active in Romania, and he went to Istanbul and he was talking to a representative of the Jewish agency. He gives them this plan. The Jewish agency immediately sends it to the United States. It's published in the New York Times. The State Department picks it up, and the State Department promptly buries it and doesn't do anything, saying that you can't trust it, you can't rely on it, it's probably propaganda, and so on and so forth. So what do? They take this item and they put it in an ad, right? And they have a very provocative headline: "For sale to humanity, 70,000 Jews, guaranteed human beings at $50 a piece." So they publish these advertisements, and basically they have a little coupon at the bottom of the advertisement, and they say, "We at the Emergency Committee to Save the Jews of Europe are actively trying to promote or to put pressure on the Roosevelt administration to promote plans for rescue. Please do anything you can, write a letter to your congressman, to your senator, and so on and so forth. Help us to bring this news to the forefront." So they publish this, and they publish, as I said, 200 ads throughout the war, in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the New Republic, in the Boston Globe, in all the big newspapers. Also, Randolph Hearst, the newspaper mogul who the movie Citizen Kane was made about Randolph Hearst. He owned a network of hundreds of newspapers, small newspapers throughout the United States. He was a big supporter of the Emergency Committee. He published their ads for free. He often wrote editorials in support of the news that they were publishing in their advertisements. And each time the idea of the ads is similar. They take something that just happened, whether it was the Bermuda Conference that supposedly took place to deal with refugees and with issues of the extermination of the Jews, and they publish it in big ads so that people can't ignore it. My uncle Abraham reports eventually in one of his meetings with Eleanor Roosevelt, she tells my father, they managed to make contact with Eleanor Roosevelt. She was a supporter of the committee. They were hoping that through their contacts with Eleanor Roosevelt, they would reach Franklin Roosevelt, but that never happened. But she tells my father that actually this advertisement, my uncle Abraham reports, really got to President Roosevelt, and it upset him, which means that he was reading the ads, right? I mean, he was reading the ads. The State Department was reading the ads. The American public was reading the ads. Okay, so that's one kind of strategy that they were using. Another strategy was the production of pageants, of these kind of mass spectacles. And they produced one major pageant in 1943. It was called "We Will Never Die." The script was written by Ben Heck. The music was written by Kurt Weill. It was original composition by Kurt Weill that accompanied the pageant. It was produced by Billy Rose, and it was staged by Moss Hart. It had Paul Muni, Edward J. Robinson, Stella Adler, a lot of very famous kind of Hollywood actors. And basically it was a pageant, it was a spectacle. And during the spectacle on stage, they told the history of the Jewish people, and they of course reached the point of extermination, and they talk about what is happening to the Jews of Europe. And they come out in the end with this very passionate cry, "Remember us." It's a very melodramatic, dramatic spectacle, and it's unbelievable. It opens in Madison Square Garden I have the date here, I lost my place, so I don't know what the date is. First night is March 9th, 1943. They open at Madison Square Garden. There's so many people who want to see it that they actually have a second showing in Madison Square Garden on the same night. So 10,000 people actually view this spectacle in one night. The mayor of New York City, Fiorello LaGuardia, who was a supporter of the Emergency Committee, attends the pageant. The governor of New York declares that day as a day of mourning, as today we have in Israel, a day of mourning for the horrible catastrophe that happened at Meron. So he declares that day as a day of mourning in the entire state of New York. And basically the pageant travels the United States. They stage the pageant in New York City, in the Hollywood Bowl, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in Washington, D.C. They have a special production in the evening. That's kind of a picture of the stage. They have a special staging of it in Washington, D.C., where it's attended by 6 Supreme Court judges, by foreign diplomats, by congressmen, by senators, and Eleanor Roosevelt herself attends the pageant, and she writes about it in a column that she has called My Day. And she writes, as I write on the, as I bring the quote on the screen, "We will never die is one of the most impressive and moving pageants I have ever seen. No one who heard each group come forward and give the story of what had happened to it at the hands of a ruthless German military will ever forget those haunting words, 'Remember us.'" So as I said, Eleanor Roosevelt was a big supporter of the Emergency Committee and their activities, but unfortunately her support was not transferred to her husband. I will talk a little bit later on as I close my talk about why the pageant actually didn't perform more often, because there were a lot of other performances that were scheduled in smaller towns, but the leadership of the American Jewish community managed to prevent the staging of the pageant, and we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of my talk. The third and final, or the third point that I want to mention is the March of the Rabbis. They organized 3 days before Yom Kippur in 1943. My father, along with Vad Hatzalah, which is an Orthodox Jewish organization, they managed to recruit 400 Orthodox rabbis, very important rabbis, to march to the Capitol. Now, again, today, kind of marches on Washington are a common activist kind of mechanism, strategy. At the time, it was very uncommon. There were no marches on Washington. It's the first massive march on Washington. It's the first protest rally in Washington during the war to protest the extermination of the Jews. So they take this group of 400 rabbis. They march from Union Station, if any of you know Washington, D.C., from Union Station to the Capitol. At the Capitol, they're met by the Senate Majority Leader. They hand him a petition that's signed by the 400 rabbis in which they demand more action on part of the Roosevelt administration to rescue their brethren in Europe. They say prayers, and then they continue walking to the White House. At the White House, it was hoped that they would be met by President Roosevelt, but they are met by the Vice President, who greets them and apologizes for President Roosevelt. Later on, historian David Wyman, who's written extensively about the Emergency Committee, discovered in the archives that it was President Roosevelt's Jewish advisor, Samuel Rosenman, who convinced Roosevelt not to meet the rabbis, right? And not to come out to the White House saying that they're the wrong kind of Jews, that you do not want to see them, that, you know, all of these, what were the Jewish kind of arguments against the Emergency Committee. And again, I'll kind of go into that a little bit more in detail. But despite the pressure of the Jewish organizations, actually, the March of the Rabbis was a very successful tactic. It was very, very widely written about in the press, and there was a lot of criticism of Roosevelt on having not gone out to meet the crying rabbis. These kind of public relations activities happen hand in hand with basically a lobbying campaign, right? I mean, throughout all of this time, as they're promoting the newspaper ads and the pageants and the March on Washington, they're basically walking up and down the halls of Congress, and they're knocking on doors and they're gathering a lot of support. They basically lobby for rescue. So it's, as I said in the beginning, it's the public kind of pressure of these campaigns, of these ads, and a lot of public support for the Emergency Committee. And they managed to recruit a lot of support in Congress. I just brought a few of the examples. US Representative Emanuel Seller was very active. Senator Guy Gillette from Iowa, Will Rogers, Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, Senator Albert Thomas. They had a lot of support in Congress and in the Senate, that they basically kind of convinced them that something more needs to be done to address what's happening to European Jewry. And basically the campaign, the rescue campaign, the public relations campaign, along with the lobbying campaign, reached kind of a height, a peak in December 1943. Senator Guy Gillette and Representative Will Rogers promote a rescue resolution in Congress. The resolution basically demands more active involvement of the Roosevelt administration in promoting plans for rescue. It's coming up for a vote in the Congress and in the Senate, and Roosevelt knows that it's going to pass. At the same time, there's growing pressure from the Treasury Department on Roosevelt to promote rescue plans. So the pressure from the Treasury Department, the imminent passing of the rescue resolution as a result of the public relations campaign mounted by the Emergency Committee, together convince Roosevelt that something needs to be done. And so to preempt the passing of the rescue resolution, in January 22, 1945, Roosevelt calls a press conference and he declares the establishment of the War Refugee Board. The War Refugee Board, and this is from the congressional record, is tasked with the immediate rescue and relief of the Jews of Europe and other victims of enemy persecution. And so the rescue resolution is taken off the table and the War Refugee Board is established. So the War Refugee Board is basically a government agency, right? Whose sole purpose is to promote and to implement plans that are aimed at rescue and relief of the Jews of Europe. So basically, this is the goal that my father's committee set out to achieve. It was achieved in 1944. It was pretty late in the game. It was very underfunded. It didn't receive a lot of government funds. It was basically funded by Jewish money. But nonetheless, the War Refugee Board was an achievement, and it achieved the rescue of what historians say is close to 200,000 Jews. The War Refugee Board staff worked with Jewish organizations, diplomats from neutral countries, and resistance groups in Europe to rescue Jews from occupied territories and to provide relief to Jews in hiding and in concentration camps. Basically, they funded foreign diplomats like Raoul Wallenberg, who was funded by the War Refugee Board. They encouraged diplomats, they funded them to assist in giving out visas to Jews who were trapped in Europe. The War Refugee Board established the only safe haven camp in the United States that was established to house refugees in Oswego in upstate New York. It housed 1,000 Jews, which isn't much, but it's something. They put pressure on neutral countries like Turkey to accept refugees. And basically, the Jews that it managed to save, these 200,000 Jews, are primarily Jews from Hungary in Budapest and from Romania in Transnistria. These were the main communities of Jews who had survived at that point in 1944. And you know, they attribute 200,000 Jews, which again, my father always said it was too late and too little, but it was an achievement nonetheless. Okay, that's the flag. A flag is born. This is another pageant that they put up, but this is for independence in Palestine. So that's the topic of a different lecture. So now I'd like to kind of end my talk with talking a little bit about the opposition to the Emergency Committee, or to the Bergson Group as they were known. So basically the final chapter in this story concerns the second front. Okay, throughout the war, my father always used to say we had to fight on two fronts. The main front was the Roosevelt administration, right? Trying to convince the administration and the anti-Semites in the State Department and the public opinion in America that the rescue of Jews was a worthy war effort. But the second front that they had to fight was the front put up by basically the united leadership of established American Jewry in the United States, who fought my father and the efforts of the Emergency Committee from the beginning. And the opposition to my father increased as they gained more and more support and as they became more and more popular. And the opposition took place on a number of levels. Rabbi Wise, Proskauer, Rabbi Silver, Nahum Goldman, who was in the United States, and other less famous and less known names who were leadership of the many American Jewish and American Jewish Zionist organization. For example, they would systematically contact supporters of the committee and try and convince them to remove their support. In the context of the pageant, for example, as I mentioned earlier, in cities like Buffalo, in cities like Gary, Indiana, in cities like Baltimore, where the pageant was scheduled to be produced, leaders like Stephen Wise and Rabbi Silver would contact local Jewish leaders and local businessmen within the community and basically threaten them that they should not agree to put up that they should not support the pageant. David Wyman has written about it. I myself has done some research in the archives. We found lists in the archives of the American Zionist Organization and the Emergency Zionist Committee, lists of supporters of the Bergson Group that they, with the phone numbers, that they would contact one by one and try to convince them to remove their support. On another level, Rabbi Wise used his contacts in the White House and in the government to get the FBI to investigate the emergency committee, to get the IRS to investigate the emergency committee. They tried to deport my father. They tried to recruit and draft my father and other leaders of the emergency committee. Basically, they did everything they could to fight the emergency committee. And the arguments that they used were also varied, but basically there were two kinds of arguments that they used. The first argument was basically, as I kind of mentioned briefly before, was that they were the wrong kind of Jews. They were vulgar. They talked openly about saving Jews. They weren't afraid to splash the word Jew across the New York Times. They would basically, in their vulgarity and in their kind of in-your-face kind of tactics, what Rabbi Wise and Nahum Goldman said, that they would actually be counterproductive to promoting rescue, that they would annoy the Gentiles, that they would annoy the Roosevelt administration. There's a letter that also David Wyman found in the archives, that was written by Nahum Goldman to Isaiah Berlin in England. And basically he says that if Hitler brought anti-Semitism to Europe, Hillel, Kook, or Peter Bergson would bring anti-Semitism to America. That was kind of the first group of arguments against them. And the second group, which was also, was kind of related, was that they represented no one. They were nobodies. Mi samcha, who authorized you to speak for European Jewry? You don't have a constituency. You don't have a congregation. So basically, those were kind of the arguments that were posed openly by the American Jewish leadership. I think that if we try to think together about what motivated them, why did they act in such a way? I mean, it's clear that American Jewry and American Jewish leadership were besides themselves with news of the extermination. No Jew in America at the time didn't have family in Europe. I mean, everybody came from Europe at some point. They cared deeply about what was happening to European Jewry. But the leadership, first of all, they were older. My father and his colleagues were very young. They had no fear. They were relentless. And the leadership of the American Jewry, of kind of the official American Jewish organizations, they were older and they also had status in American society. They were part of the power structure within American society, and they had the benefits of power, benefits of not of power, but of status within American society. I think somebody's not on mute. And I think that it was hard for them. They were afraid to lose their position in American society. My father and his colleagues had no status in American society. They were foreigners. They didn't belong to America. They didn't grow up in America. They had no dreams of belonging to the Harvard Club. I mean, my father always used to say, when people would say, and one of the big arguments against my father and against kind of the idea that something could have been done and that more could have been done, was that, what do you want? There was anti-Semitism in America. American Jews were afraid, and American Jewish leadership was afraid. And of course there was anti-Semitism in America, and in the State Department there was anti-Semitism. And probably the anti-Semitism in the State Department was one of the primary reasons that prevented Roosevelt from promoting rescue campaigns. Roosevelt himself and his family had many anti-Semitic relatives. It's said that perhaps Roosevelt himself was anti-Semitic. Nonetheless, the anti-Semitism in America was not institutional anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism in America prevented Jews perhaps from being accepted to the Harvard Club, from being accepted to Harvard Medical School, okay? From being accepted to exclusive clubs, to institutions of higher learning. Yes, all of that is true. But those were the kind of achievements of status that for my father and his group were irrelevant. And this also brings me back a little bit to what I said about his humanistic upbringing and his liberal upbringing. I think that as a group of foreigners who came to America, who came from Europe, who came from Palestine, they had a wider perspective in a way, right? And they could see in a way, being foreign and being young and being outside of that kind of structure gave them the freedom to have a wider outlook, I think. I'd like to end with a story that my father told in one of the interviews, which I actually only recently heard when I heard he gave an oral history. He said, in one of his interviews, he said that he was in Washington, DC, and he met up with a very famous Irish judge, American Irish judge. And this judge kind of stopped him on the street and they were talking, and he said, you know, I don't understand you. If 10,000 Irishmen were burned a day in German ovens, not one window in Washington, DC would remain whole. Not one congressman would be able to sleep through the night, because we Irish, we would raise hell until Roosevelt did something. And then he looked at my father and he said, what's wrong with you Jews? Why are you so quiet? Why are you so obedient? And for my father, that was the heart of the issue. He believed until his last years that had the Jewish community and the organized Jewish leadership of America collaborated together to promote rescue, much more could have been done. Many more Jewish lives could have been saved. They couldn't have stopped the extermination. They couldn't have saved all the Jews, but they could have done more. They could have saved more Jews. And for my father, until the Jewish leadership today doesn't do a cheshbon nefesh with their activities during the war, there is no chance really to normalize Jewish existence and to normalize Israeli. My father was Israeli. He was concerned with Israel primarily. So that's basically the story of my father, kind of in a nutshell. You know, I hope it was interesting to you, and I'll be happy to answer questions if you want. Thank you.
It was extremely interesting and very exciting also to hear that they were so active, because as you said in the beginning, these were informations we never got.
Mm-hmm.
And as the Europeans were also always saying that they never knew of anything, the Americans were also trying to this issue. And but the most upsetting thing is the fact that, as you said, that their own people didn't have the courage to bring it up.
Mm-hmm.
And the way the Jews before the Nazis came up were trying to assimilate in a way and be brave and quiet.
Mm-hmm.
Certain things happen the same way.
I'm sorry, I can't hear very well, and I think so. Okay, now everyone's on mute. That's good. Okay.
Yeah, there is somebody called Reuven Chaim Klein who is not now. Now
He's on mute. Now he's on mute. Yeah.
Yes. Now it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
But the question is, do you think that that the American only acted by its own ideas, or were they maybe even influenced by the Palestine politics at that time? Because I mean, the Haganah was trying to manipulate everything, and had probably also influenced till the States. I don't know. You think this was also a part of it, or was it simply the local situation that they didn't provide the support that they needed?
I'm not sure I exactly understand what you mean by the Haganah, but I will say, and actually thank you very much for raising that, because I didn't mention this, that one of the really kind of, in my opinion, very, very brilliant part of my father's campaign was that they decided from the beginning that they would keep Palestine out of it, right? I mean, my father was a Zionist. He was a member of the Irgun. There was nothing more important to him than political sovereignty in Palestine. But they also realized that if they wanted to launch a wide campaign to get widespread support for rescue, they needed to keep Palestine out of it. They needed to disconnect their demands for rescue from their demands to open the gates of Palestine and to take out the British. So, for example, in the way that they articulated, the way that they wrote the rescue resolution that was going to be up for vote in Congress had no word about Palestine. And Rabbi Wise, when he came to testify in the committee that was dealing with the rescue resolution, he said, "I'm not supporting it because it's not asking for enough. They need to add the Palestine issue into the rescue resolution. They need to demand the opening of the gates of Palestine." And for my father, that wasn't the point, that you need to be widespread. You need to ignore Palestine. You need to focus exclusively on rescue. So in that sense, I think that for the leadership of the American Jewish community, the Zionist leadership of the American Jewish community, yes, Palestine was an issue. But I think otherwise, in general, I think that the American Jewish community, and that's why I do not talk about the American Jewish community, I talk about the American Jewish leadership. I think that the American Jewish community would have done everything that it could to promote plans for rescue. But communities follow their leaders, and congregations follow their rabbis. And I think that's the tragedy, to a large extent, within the American Jewish community.
Mike?
I think concerning this last point, the tragedy is that, or was that, the American Jewry, the leadership of the American Jewry really behaved like typical diaspora Jewish organization or Jewish people, which was in contrast to what your father and his group represented. They were younger, they were self-aware, their self-awareness as Jews and as Israelis, as Palestinian Jews, was much higher. And the American Jews were, in a way, you might compare it today, it's not exactly the same, but many of the Jews living in Europe, and we all know about anti-Semitism in Europe nowadays, and many of the Jews living in Europe have, let's say, a good life or a comfortable life, and they don't want to take part, at least not actively, in any actions against anti-Semitism or to be identified at all as Jews, for instance. But allow me, it was amazing, and it was really very not interesting. It was spannend. It was really fascinating to hear this story and to hear about your father and his group, how so a few persons who had this perseverance against all odds, so to speak, and they didn't give up. And I think this is a very important lesson for all of us as Jews nowadays.
I think as human beings nowadays.
Yes,
I think
exactly.
that,
also as human beings.
I mean, I think that for all of us, a day doesn't pass, right? When we open the newspaper and we see another tragedy and another, horrible act of persecution, and we think to ourselves, what can we do? What do we do? And like, we think it's awful, and then we turn the page, right?
By the way, you mentioned the rabbis and also the religious communities who followed the rabbis, at least those who were against, were the opponents of the activity of these actions. Actually, it's against the halakha, because we have the rule of lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, which means you are not allowed, if you see somebody who is endangered, his life is endangered, you cannot just walk on or pass by and not do anything. You are obliged to stay there and to help. So actually, but we know that
but actually, the support that my father's group did get was from the Orthodox Jews.
Yeah, well, this is good to know, but it was, as you described it, it was too little and too late. Allow me to ask you a personal question. From today's perspective, how did your father's story, all his deeds and actions, affect your personal life?
Well, first of all, here I am, right? So I think that part of the answer to your question is right before you. My father, I think that, my father, I didn't talk at all about my father's political kind of ideology and his worldview and his, that really kind of emerged from his experiences during the Holocaust. He was a very political person, and I grew up in a very political home. And I think that my worldview has been very, very, very much influenced by my father. And I teach a seminar on the collective memory of the Holocaust in Israel. And I often open the first day of the seminar, when I meet my students, I tell them a story, and I say that when I grew up, when I was little, in the home, in my house, my father was a hero. I grew up hearing the stories of what he did and what he accomplished and what he achieved and what he fought and this and that. And I thought my father was a hero. But when I went to school, nobody had heard of him. And when I grew up and I went to the army, nobody had really heard of him. And it took me a long time to realize that that collective memory is a political issue. I mean, it really formulated it. It was an essential kind of mechonen, I can't think of the word, but it was really an essential kind of experience for me to understand that there's that gap between what we know and what we can find out on a personal level and what we learn in society. And that everything that we learn is kind of constructed, and its collective memory is never established in a vacuum. It always reflects power relations and hierarchies. And that was my own personal lesson about it. And I think that probably, my desire to commemorate him and to talk about him and to write about him comes from that place, from that kind of experience as a young girl, and that gap, that kind of cognitive gap. That.
Becky, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Well, first of all, I really want to thank you. It was absolutely, there are no words, really. Your talk was riveting. It was so important and so unbelievable. But your father really is like an unsung hero. And what I found very upsetting, I was at a Jewish day school all my life. I studied Jewish history, and I never heard of Hillel Kook. I never heard of Peter Bergson either. And I think it's such a shame, because we did Jewish history, and what's added shame is also in the religious circles. I mean, your father helped organized the March of the Rabbis, which is monumental. I mean, that was it was groundbreaking. So why is your father not better known in the religious circles as well, also being a descendant from the great Rav Kook, the first chief rabbi? And another question is, how can we right this injustice, this wrong? How can we right it? How can we how can we do something to actually make your father's name? He should be recognized for saving when others didn't. He did so much to he just was incredible. He's the way, his example. So why is he not mentioned at Yad Vashem? Why is he not mentioned in many Holocaust museums? It's so hard to understand.
Oh, thank you, Les. Thank you very much. I mean, with Yad Vashem, we launched a campaign. I mean, we didn't launch a campaign, but we tried to. We kind of had a petition, and we kind of worked with Yad Vashem, trying to convince them to have a mention of the emergency committee in the exhibit. And it's, I mean, I don't think I can say more than I've said. I mean, I think that, you bring up Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem is a highly politicized institution. In many ways, in many ways. And I think, I mean, maybe I actually didn't say this kind of explicitly. I don't know if for any of you who follow this, but very recently, Yad Vashem announced that it was going to include mention of the members of the Beitar youth movement who fought in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So I don't know if, I mean, it's a lot of kind of historical kind of detail, but the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is a big event in the history of the Holocaust. And up until now, the only groups who were commemorated, who took part in the uprising, were youth movements and groups who were associated with the labor movement. And Misha Arens, who was a longtime member of Chirut and of the Likud, wrote a book. He was also a kind of an amateur historian, and he wrote a book about the Beitar role, the role of Beitar in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And just like a month ago, Yad Vashem agreed to redo their exhibit of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising so as to reflect the participation of Beitar. And so a friend of mine said to me, well, they did that, so why won't they include mention of the emergency committee? And what I said to him is that including the Beitar participants in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising does not require a change of narrative. The narrative of the Holocaust memory in Israel is a narrative that has always emphasized the ghetto resistors, the people who fought with weapons against the Nazis, the partisans. That is the image of the hero in the Israeli collective memory of the Holocaust. For many years, it was the only memory of the Holocaust. To include my father into the exhibit requires a very, very significant change in the narrative, because to include my father basically requires for them to say, yes, something could have been done. And yes, we could have done something. Now that's a very, very significant change. That's not just adding, okay, we forgot that group. I'm not belittling that. That's important as well. But to introduce my father into the narrative of Holocaust memory requires a rearticulation of what happened. For Israel, the idea that nothing could have been done to save the Jews is part of our kind of raison d'etre, in a way. It's part of the political legitimacy of the state. And to open up and say, not only perhaps could something have been done, but we could have done something. That puts it all in a very different perspective. And, I think that what needs to be done is this. I mean, we need to talk about it. We need to talk about it. We need to discuss it. We need to raise these issues. we need to raise the historical event. I agree with you. I think my father is an unsung hero, but I think that more importantly is that these issues need to be discussed and need to be exposed. And we need to do a cheshbon nefesh. What does that mean about Jewish unity, for example? You know, anachnu am echad, ha'im anachnu am, are we one people? What does that mean, this slogan of we are one? You know, if in the money time, we are not one. So perhaps we need to rethink these slogans. Perhaps, I don't know, but I'm not saying we do, but all I'm saying is that these are the issues that need to be opened up. This is the debate. This is the discourse that we need to promote. And yes, also we need to commemorate my father. Of course, I that's very important for me as well. But that's just one component of it, in my opinion.
Yes, you are perfectly right. There is necessity for cheshbon nefesh and also for change of narratives. Is there a change of narrative in the American public or the Jewish American public? Yes.
There's more. There's much more. What is being written about my father is written in America. The Holocaust Museum in Washington has a very small part of the exhibit, but it has a picture of the March of the Rabbis, and it mentions him. And if you go on the website, there's a lot about him, actually. There's, I get every so often, I get emails from elementary school students or middle school students in like the middle of nowhere in Iowa, who say, oh, we're doing a class project about Peter Bergson, like we'd love to interview you. So it's in the curriculum in many schools. Kids learn about that. And it's connected to kind of this American idea and ideal of, what one person can do, right?
Exactly.
And, the American Holocaust Museum, one of its slogans is, never say I didn't know, or never turn away, or something like that. So I think that they've kind of adopted the story of the emergency committee into that kind of narrative that we need to be aware of what we do and what we say and our responsibility and so on. So yes, an answer to your question is more than here, more than in Israel.
Thank you. And thank you for this very fascinating, very moving talk, also very touching. It was very impressive.
Yeah, so I can only also support Yoli's words. It was really impressing and moving and very, very interesting. It changed a few things about our focus, how this group was working, which we didn't know, and now we learned a lot of it. And let's hope that still things are gonna maybe develop in that way, that maybe it's gonna be more in a focus. And sometimes it needs more time also in Israel to change the focus or to enlarge the focus. And as you said, it's a political issue, but politics changes also over time. So maybe the focus might also change. So maybe you have to stick to it, and I hope it's gonna bring a result. But thank you very much. It was really a great evening.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Michael, for contacting me.
A nice evening and a good week, and hopefully stay all healthy and fit. And maybe one day we're going to manage to meet.
That'll be great.
In person, meet in